Welcome to the Fortune Report. Today we will be examining Florida's House Bill number 7 and the closing of the stock market on August 26th of 2022. The Florida House Bill number 7 states, teaching must be consistent with the following principles: that no person is inherently racist, sexist, or oppressive solely by the virtue of his or her race or sex. No race is inherently superior to another race, and no person should be discriminated against or receive adverse treatment solely or partly on the basis of race, color, national origin, religion, disability, or sex. The bill goes on to state that a person by virtue of his or her race or sex does not bear responsibility for the actions committed in the past by other members of the same race or sex, and a person should not be instructed that he or she must feel guilt, anguish, or other forms of psychological distress for actions in which he or she played no part, committed in the past by other members of the same race or sex. Moving forward, specifically looking at the teaching of African American histories, um, it states that the history of African people before the political conflicts that led to the development of slavery, the passage to America, the enslavement experience, abolition, and the history and contributions of Americans of the African diaspora to society should develop the understanding and the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping of individual freedoms, and examine what it means to be a responsible and respectful person for the purposes of encouraging tolerance of diversity in a pluralistic society, and for nurturing and protecting democratic values and institutions. The bill goes on to say instructional materials shall include the vital contributions of African Americans to build and strengthen American society and celebrate the inspirational stories of African Americans who prospered even in the most difficult circumstances. The bill further states, however, classroom instruction and curriculum may not be used to indoctrinate or persuade students to a particular point of view inconsistent with the principles enumerated in subsection 3. Looking at some of the criticism of Florida's HB7, the ACLU complaint states the act prohibits instructors and students from expressing viewpoints disfavored by the Florida's legislature. And although HB7 states the instruction cannot be used to indoctrinate or persuade students to a particular viewpoint, according to Steve Contorno of CNN, Florida schools will hold Victims of Communism Day, where high schoolers will be taught anti-communism lessons. And although the bill outlines clear support for promoting Afro-American contributions to the history of the United States, according to Daniel Villarreal, Michael James, a teacher at O.J. Sims Elementary School, resigned after posters of Afro-American historical figures were taken down. According to Mr. James, he created a bulletin board with Martin Luther King Jr., Harriet Tubman, Colin Powell, and George Washington Carver, noting their historic achievements. The analyst monitoring Mr. James also removed the portrait of President Barack Obama from the teacher's desk. When it comes to teaching Afro-American history, this country does not have a good track record. For example, according to Sierra Maney, Mississippi uses a social studies book published in 2005 that mentions the civil rights movement on 5 out of 100 pages. The freedom riders aren't mentioned at all, even though they appear in the state's standard. To combat the failure to adequately teach Afro-American contributions to the history of the United States, according to Maney, teachers are working to fill in the gaps between school materials and the standards they're expected to teach. According to Maney, before 2011, Mississippi schools weren't required to teach about the civil rights movement at all. According to Rebecca Klein, private schools, especially Christian schools, use textbooks that tell a version of history that is racially biased and often inaccurate. popular textbooks used in those schools describe slavery as black immigration. The Republican Party and Ron DeSantis in Florida are implementing policies widely used by the Communist Chinese Party, Chinese Communist Party. For example, an article by Jack Dutton explains how China has been increasingly tightening restrictions on its education system. These restrictions included banning foreign syllabus to boost youth patriotism. Primary and secondary school students are also being taught about President Xi's ideologies to subvert the influence of Western values, vowing the Communist Party would strengthen its leadership over education materials to ensure they would always adhere to the correct political direction and value orientation. Although I agree with the outlined principles in the bill that no person is inherently racist, sexist, or oppressive, or no race is inherently superior to another race, and that no person shall be discriminated against, the Republicans in Florida have adapted the Chinese Communist Party's policy on education. The legislature of Florida has politicized education. This is something that has swept across the country. The Florida bill uses age as the linchpin to erase the atrocities committed on African Americans and the Native populations, and to use the accomplishments of African Americans to suggest where we are today is what the United States has always been. So, in other words, lynchings, horrors of chattel slavery, Jim Crow segregation, and more will be whitewashed. In doing so, schools will teach only the concepts that will build a positive national myth. No Emmett Till, Tulsa race riots, Wilmington race riots, or the Trail of Tears. For that fact, anything which can be determined as age inappropriate will not be taught in public schools, public or private schools, according to the Florida legislature. So in practice, this means generations of future citizens will believe the national myth. The myth is slavery was an institution forced on the Americas by European monarchies who were fight off by self-made white Anglo-Saxon Protestant men who owned slaves but disliked the idea of slavery. This myth will go on describing how white Anglo-Saxon Protestant men fought the Civil War to end slavery, which eventually leads to the Civil Rights Movement and the election of the first African American president. There will continue to be little to no mention of the genocide of native populations. Thus, as the myth will have us believe, the sins of this country were paid for in blood, and African American and native populations are in their current situation solely based on their ability to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. Closing out, taking a look at the market review. The market on August 26th closed down from the market on August 12th, 2022. The Dow was down $1,477.65. The NASDAQ was down $905.48. And the S&P 500 was down $222.49.